afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the session where we'll look at how behavioural science can help us understand, address and prevent sexual harassment. Before we get started, just a couple of practicalities. We'll be using Slido to ask or submit questions to the speakers, so you can access that either through the BX app or through downloading the actual Slido app, or you can just literally Google sli.do and then put in the event code that will be on the slides. We also tweet hashtag BX2019. Now, as we know, sexual harassment is unfortunately not a niche topic. Every second woman in the EU has experienced sexual harassment since the age of 15. 1 in 5 women in the EU have experienced it in the past year. Most women aged 14 to 21 in the UK have experienced sexual attention or contact in a public space, and 15% are groped in public places once a month, on average. Many women, as well as some men, in the UK have experienced unwanted sexual behaviour in the workplace. And if we think about the context of politics, women parliamentarians across a number of countries have been the target of online sex attacks, and many have suffered sexual violence. Before we start, I thought I'd like to do a quick poll. Can you put your hand up if you feel you're able to identify sexual harassment? So if I was to describe a series of situations, would you know if that was sexual harassment or not? Just put your hand up if you feel, okay, that's pretty good. Sexual harassment has different definitions, but broadly they look something like this. This is the Government Equalities Office definition. It says unwanted, unsolicited, unwelcome contact of a sexual nature, which is the purpose or effect, so not necessarily intentional, of violating dignity or creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating or offensive environment. So that's a really broad definition and basically covers everything from kind of sexist jokes, commenting on how someone looks, on their body, on their appearance, that makes them feel uncomfortable, to more sort of blatant forms of sexual advances, unwanted sexual advances, groping, all the way to sexual harassment, assault and rape. So today, we'll hear from 2 people who've studied sexual harassment and assault in real-life contexts, and they'll help us understand what are the drivers, but also how we might tackle based in behavioural science. So the first speaker, it's my delight to present Professor Betsy Levy Paluck from Princeton University. She is a professor in the psychology department and in the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Professor Levy Paluck's research is concerned with things like reduction of prejudice and conflict, including ethnic and political conflict, youth conflict in schools, and violence against women. And she uses large-scale field experiments to test different interventions that target individuals' perceived norms. We'll hear, I think, a fair bit about norms, and behaviour about conflict, including, for example, mass media and peer-to-peer interventions. So really exciting stuff. Professor Paluck is a 2017 MacArthur Fellow and has been the recipient of the Sage Young Scholars Award, the Cialdini Award for Field Research, and the Early Career Award from American Psychological Association. We are so delighted to have you. Please join me in welcoming Professor Paluck.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. So I'm going to talk today about mostly assault, but also I think much of what I talk about in terms of a theoretical model and some of the interventions that have been tried also cover harassment. And we can talk more about extensions in the Q&A, and I'm looking forward to that. I want to start by saying that the most prominent examples of sexual assault in our public discourse on the American side, but also on the European side and elsewhere, the most prominent examples like this guy have also been some of the most aggravated, right? So they're repeat offenders that do things that cross the line for most people. We can all agree upon that, right? And it turns out that when people think about sexual assault, and specifically why sexual assault occurs, they think about people like that, like Harvey Weinstein or others. Many more examples have come up since then. And they focus specifically on the qualities of the perpetrator. Right? So some scholarly perspectives actually do the same as that. And in particular, in my field, psychology, clinical psychology in particular, that particular area of psychology, does focus on the qualities of people, and mostly men, who commit sexual assaults. And so this talk is going to be about our theories of sexual assault, not just our scholarly theories, but also our lay theories, like our folk wisdom about why sexual assault occurs and harassment. And what I want to argue to you and see what you think is that in both cases we need a much more behavioral understanding of sexual assault. And by that I mean an approach that really considers the person, absolutely, but the person in the context, and specifically in the immediate context that they find themselves in. So that could be a work situation, that could be a school situation. And I want to press us to think more about those immediate contexts. And so part of the argument is that this transition to thinking about sexual assault and harassment in behavioral terms is really not trivial. The ideas that we have about perpetrators and their characteristics are really appealing to us and really sticky. And it's led to some sticky policy solutions that have been around for some time. And I want to talk about that a little bit today as well. So I think that imagining more behavioral interventions are really going to have some important implications for innovations in interventions. Okay. So that's the behavioral approach, and I'll get more into that in a second. But let me tell you one way that I got started in thinking about this topic, okay? So I, basically live on a campus in the United States, so it's right in my backyard. And it turns out that actually one of the most prominent theories about campus-based or university-based sexual assault in the U.S. follows this pattern of really focusing in on the qualities of the perpetrator, and it's called the serial rapist model. Have many people heard of this? No? So it's a model mostly promoted by a really prominent theorist and policy advocate named David Lisak in the States. And the idea of it is that the majority of rapes on a college campus and assaults on a college campus are actually perpetrated by a very small number of people who are doing this serially, okay? And they get the idea from a much cited survey on repeat rape and multiple offending, and the idea here is that this very small group of serial rapists are types of people who plan, who premeditate. They're also typed in that they have lower levels of empathy than average and greater hostility toward women. Okay? So there's a lot of critiques of this study. I'm not going to go into the pointy-headed scholarly details, but suffice to say that there's a lot of problems with this study, and it turns out that it's one study that has really supported this view on most rapes being attributable to these serial perpetrators. Okay, and so here's some of the reasons, and I can go into any of them in the Q&A if you like. But what it turns out when you do, and some scholars that I'm listing down here at the bottom, when you do this survey again, trying to improve on many of the critiques that I just flashed at you that I can explain more about, what you see, this is sort of going across time. These are as university students come to a campus. And this is their admitting of having committed or attempted to commit rape. What you see is actually there are many different types of people, and these are mostly men, on a college campus. There are not just, if we thought that this was just a serial rapist model, you should just see a straight line going across the top, right, across all of their time. Instead, what you see are some really interesting different patterns that suggest that something is going on in terms of their adjustment to the college context, right? So some people are not doing anything before college or in year one, but maybe join a particular context and become socialized into a particular space where they're much more likely by year 3 or 4 to commit rape. And then it's the opposite for other people, right? And then, of course, there are people, who never do so. So this is a really interesting contribution, and their conclusion from these data was that this exclusive emphasis on trying to find serial predators is really misguided. And the problem is that it's been calling, the model has been used to call for a particular type of policy, which is a bystander intervention. But it turns out that we really persist in believing this idea about serial rapists, at least in the United States and at least on college campuses, right? It's been contested in the media that really picked up on the findings that I just showed to you that question whether this is really the case. And so one way that we got into this research is that we were really interested in knowing, why is this story so sticky? Why do people continue to believe that the majority of assaults are committed by these sort of deranged individuals, right? One reason is that it's a pretty simple story, right? So there are some bad apples out there, and if we could just find them and apprehend them, right, or defend against them, we would solve the issue of assault and harassment on campus. And in doing so, in providing this simple story, it preserves this idea that we humans really love, which is that the world is just, right? That there are good and bad people, and it avoids really problematizing human nature and our social contexts, right? There are just certain bad apples. So we actually set out to empirically investigate this, and what you're seeing here is scatter plots that show the more you personally have a need to believe in justice in the world, the more you personally believe in sort of the essential nature of humans, and you really need things to be straightforward and simple and closed, the more you are likely to believe the serial rapist model as an individual. So what we're trying to say, we're trying to make a point that there's reasons in society that these simple models really persist and that they recommend particular policies to us. But we can even see this within individuals, right? So the more you like these kinds of explanations, the more you gravitate towards this particular explanation for assault, right? Okay, so as I mentioned, Lisak and those who really focus in on this type of explanation have been very influential in the United States, at least, in promoting bystander interventions, okay? And the rationale is that rather than focusing on prevention, which is really difficult because these people are, standard deviations lower on empathy and higher on hostility toward women, we should all just look out for one another. These people are hard to change. There are very few of them, so we should use bystander interventions. Now, I want to say, back up for a second, there are other reasons, and a lot of feminist theories in particular have recommended bystander interventions for other reasons than protecting one another from serial assaulters, right? But this was actually the reason that bystander interventions really took off in the States. And by took off, I really mean took off. So President Obama's commission on, a very groundbreaking commission on protecting students from sexual assault cited bystander intervention as probably the main way to go, and provided a lot of training and resources to implement these bystander interventions. Okay. So what kinds of interventions we wanted to ask, what kinds of interventions would we think about if we understood assault from a behavioral perspective? So let me shift gears for a second. So instead of thinking about the possibility that there's only a few bad guys out there and they're the ones doing all of this, how would we start to think about prevention and intervention? Okay? So first of all, we would focus on individuals, yes, but we would focus on the product between how an individual is and what kind of environment they're in. Okay? And really, we felt when we started out this work, and it's really still ongoing, that there's not a long tradition of applying the behavioral science perspective to assault and harassment. So that's one reason why I'm so happy that you're hosting this panel today. So let me give you an example of behavioral science, how a behavioral science study would go about mapping out some of these kinds of dynamics, right? So this is actually a recent lab study. This isn't in the field. I'm going to talk about some field studies that we've been doing. This one is about power, right? And what I love about this study is that it's not just about who has power in general, right? So you can think about your workplaces, who's the boss, who's the supervisor. This study is about people who have chronic levels of power, being the supervisor, or chronic levels of being less powered, right? And also what they call acute levels of power. So I'm going to put you in a situation where suddenly you have power. Maybe you're not the supervisor, but I'm going to put you in a situation where you have to judge another coworker. You suddenly have this, acute situational level of power. And what they find in this study is that the men, this is all men respondents, they were being asked, what do you think about if you had an opportunity to pursue an attraction at work that you knew was unrequited? What they found is that the people who were most likely to say that they would pursue it, even knowing that this person was not interested, were the ones who had chronic low power, right? So they're actually not the supervisors, but they were suddenly given power in a particular situation. And their willingness to pursue someone shot up relative to those the supervisors who were given power in that situation too, versus a control. I love this study because it's both telling us something stable about the individual, but also about what's happening in that moment, right? And this kind of variability is not what we would expect if we thought that the predilection for assault and harassment is something inherent, right? So I am not going to drag you through this, but one thing that we're working on right now is a kind of toolkit to get people who are thinking about different kinds of interventions to think through different features of a situation, everything from the actual geographic configuration. Did anybody read about, okay, here's another crazy story from American universities. Did anyone read about the fact that PhDs in economics who are applying for jobs normally have to go into hotel rooms to interview at the annual conference? Did anyone know this? So in order to get a job, if you meet an economist here today, you can, say sorry for them. But the way they had to get their job was to go to their annual conference and go into a hotel room where the faculty of that particular university were and sit on the bed and answer a bunch of questions about their research as everyone sat around them, right? They finally just banned this. The AEA just banned this the other day, which is amazing, right? And this is one of the things that we're talking about. Literally, what are the spaces that you're in, right? And the Ben Bernanke, one of the heads of the American Economic Association, said, to my knowledge, no bad behavior happened in those spaces. But that's not quite the point, right? What is being triggered, what is being made salient as someone is sitting and interviewing in front of a bunch of people on a hotel bed, right? So these are some of the things, and also features of the person to consider. Some of them are not personality traits, right? So we're not talking about, what is serial, what is stable about you, but rather, how are you perceiving people? What are your goals in the situation, right? Alcohol is something that's often cited as a trigger for sexual harassment. One thing that we know about alcohol is that it actually doesn't make you uninhibited, it makes you myopic. It makes you completely unaware of things that are blocking your current goal, right? So you're not always completely unaware, but less aware, right? So using really good psychological, behavioral science evidence about all of these different features of the people in the situation, we've been trying to build this framework for helping people to think about what kinds of interventions would you design for your particular context. Okay. So I'm going to end by telling you a couple of ways that we've been thinking about this lately. And they're two very different interventions. One, we're going to stay on an American university campus, and one, we're going to go to Uganda. Okay? So, am I doing okay on time? Okay, great. So let's go. First, an American campus. So the status of sexual consent as a moral requirement is still very much in process in the United States, right? So what do I mean by that? There's a lot of discussion about asking for consent before you engage in a sexual act with someone. And sometimes it's actually made fun of, which tells us that this is not a property of something that has reached a moral stage of reasoning, right? So it's still very new. Some subcommunities have accepted it as a value of theirs that is very important, and others are still questioning it. okay? So in response to a lot of news about sexual assault and harassment, at Princeton, which is where I teach, we have a lot of student clubs, student social clubs. They're incredibly central to students' lives. And on Thursday and Friday nights in particular, all of our students will go to at least one of these clubs. And they're run completely by students. They're actually not a part of the university at all. Only recently did some women start to become presidents of these social clubs. And at one of them, where the woman who was president, the first woman president, decided to do something different on a Friday night. So this social club was responsible for throwing the Friday night party that a majority of the campus visits on any given Friday on the Princeton campus. And what they decided to do was to ask all people entering the party to read aloud a pledge about consent. And if you refused to read it aloud, you weren't allowed inside. Okay? And this is what they designed. We just grabbed this. This is a screenshot from someone who took a picture of this when they were entering the party on Snapchat. And they asked people to read, "Consent is asking for and receiving affirmation before and while engaging in anyone's personal space, belongings, and can be revoked at any time." So we heard about this, and we thought, ooh, wow, this is really exciting. And I'll tell you a bunch of reasons why it's exciting. I hope by now my preamble has, gotten you to think of some reasons why I would find this very exciting. The first reason, which I'm actually not even going to put up on the screen, is that the actual people involved came up with the idea, right? This was a bottom-up intervention. This was something the students had thought of themselves. This was not, as most things happen at our university and at almost all universities and organizations I know, top-down in the language of the administrators, in the language of the supervisors, right? Some theoretical reasons why I found it exciting. So I'm a big one for perceived norms. So the idea that a particular behavior is socially desirable or socially undesirable, I think this guides a lot of our actual enacted behaviors, even when we personally don't agree with it. And one thing that we know about our perception of norms is that they're very much affected by our peers and by important institutions. And so this was a pledge that was coming directly from your peers. They ran the organization. They were prominent. They were the presidents and treasurers of your society. And this was coming directly from them. And they were going to kick you out if you didn't do it. The other reason that we really love this is that it was situationally, I'll call it situationally fit, right? So it's hitting you just as you go into the party. It's framing the party in a much different way, right? Instead of sort of like encouraging people on as they go inside, you're actually halting them for a second and getting them to think about the idea of consent. And so when I talked to you about goals earlier, this sort of gives you a different type of goal for the party. Okay, so we were very interested in the language they used. And when we brought the president and some of her administration into my office to talk about this, it turns out that they were engineering and science majors, and we said, we'd love to test this out to see if it's working. And they said, what would be an appropriate control group? And I thought, love you guys. So ethically, and I respect this very much, they did not want to isolate a pure control group where no one got a pledge at the door. So what we said to them is, we really think, actually, that your language is very interesting. This isn't necessarily the language that a psychologist would use. It's almost a bit legalistic. It's pretty dry. You never mention sexual assaults or anything like that. Even though you're trying to, it seems, push the idea of consent into this moral realm, you never use any moral language at all. So we said, well, would you let a psychologist design a pledge? And they said, all right, and amazingly let us do it. So we really gave them what we called the psychological sledgehammer. We used normative, moral, and very explicit language. And so half of the students entering a party on a couple of Fridays read, Princeton students know, for sexual activity to be right, it must be consensual. I stand with my fellow Princeton students, non-consensual sex is not sex, it's violence. I'm responsible for getting and receiving consent, which cannot be given when incapacitated and can be revoked at any time. Now, mind you, every single person that entered the party had to read this aloud, okay? So this is how we did our trial. We actually did it at 2 different eating clubs. Let me get to that in a second, but let me just take you through what a trial looks like. So they call them eating clubs, excuse me. So they're social clubs, but that's the name there. That's why it's reported that way. So if you want to go to this party, and about 300 people did at a time, each night we studied this, the students come into the party, and we had sort of like a TSA agent at the door who was randomly assigning them to one side or the other. Depending on the side you were randomly assigned to, you either got the original or this moralistic pledge, and then you got your hand stamped with a slightly different stamp according to the pledge that you got. Then when you came out of the party at whatever time of night, we were actually waiting there with a survey, and by we, I don't mean me. I was going to recognize far too many of those students. We were waiting with pizza and water, and if you wanted to, it was an optional survey. We asked you a bunch of questions about your reactions to the pledge, your memory for it, and your opinion of it. Okay? So we ended up doing this at 2 different social clubs, 2 eating clubs. The one that had already introduced this, and now this is where it's really key to think about context. One had already introduced this, it was their initiative, it was their language, and then we modified it. And the other, their president attended that party and said, hey, I'd like to try this at my club. They had never done any kind of sexual assault initiative or consent training initiative at their club at any time. Okay? So what did we find? We found that pledging consent at the door was effective. Students were, I'm not going to tell you which one yet. Students remembered one of the pledges more than the other. They thought it was really clear, so that we asked them, how clear is consent? Because that actually turns out to be a big issue for students, that they don't even understand really what consent is. And it changed their perceived norms about consent, in the sense of they were more likely to agree that their friends support it, and they were more likely to say that others should do it in sort of a prescriptive way, okay? But the pledge that worked actually depended on the club, on that club's precedent. So you may have guessed this already, but the ones who favored the moral pledge were the people, were the club who had already done something about it. The ones who favored the original pledge, we found the same positive findings, but actually completely reversed in favor of that original sort of drier legalistic language, were the students attending the party where they had never done anything like this before, okay? So I think that, just to summarize a couple of brief lessons here, this was language that was really fit to the context, right? We were doing an original intervention with these student clubs, right? So it was very bottom up, but we found that even in that case, the language needed to be tailored in these different sub-communities within the sub-community, right? Okay, do you want me to wrap? Okay, so I'm gonna finish. We had another study that we did in Uganda, and I can maybe talk about it in the Q&A, but that's all the time for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Betsy. That was wonderful and very thought-provoking. Before I introduce our second speaker, I just wanted to make a quick note that quite a lot of the research that we're presenting to you today is as of yet unpublished, so we would kindly ask you not to tweet about it or talk about it too publicly. You can, I'll ask the speakers to also specify that, during the Q&A. But yeah, just for now, sort of as you're potentially tweeting, maybe, hold off sort of sharing exactly the numbers and findings that you see. Right. So our next speaker is our very own Dr. Iseult Cremen, who works in the Behavioural Insights team's Australian office. Her work focuses on employment, gender diversity and health. Iseult did her PhD at the Trinity College Institute of Neuroscience, where her research looked at cognitive ageing and brain health. I would say Iseult's been instrumental to the Behavioural Insights team work on sexual harassment, and in particular understanding how we can encourage positive bystander behaviours to tackle sexual harassment, which is what she's going to be talking about to us today. Please join me in welcoming Iseult.
Thanks for the introduction there. So hi everybody, I'm Iseult. I'm here today to talk to you about some of the work we've recently finished in Australia. I'm also focusing on the university campus experience. So many of us here today will have had the experience, have been lucky enough to have the experience of going to university or be attending university, and have had quite a brilliant learning opportunity. But we carried out an initial survey of students in Australian campuses, one campus in particular, and we found that unfortunately it wasn't always the case. So first I'm going to start off by sharing with you 3 experiences that we gathered in this survey. I had a pushy and creepy lab partner. He would undermine me and then pretty much followed me home. I ended up dropping out of the class so he wouldn't follow me around and text me anymore. I wish I had never even sat near him. He took a toll on my life. So the next experience I'm going to present is somebody talking about one of their teachers in campus. He started invading my personal space, winking at me, unnecessarily touching me, coming up with stupid excuses to spend time with me. I could have kicked up a big fuss, but this teacher was popular in the community and I'm not, so it wouldn't have been worth it for me to have kicked up a fuss. And the third experience I'm going to share is from somebody talking about what they saw happen to one of their friends. He was really touchy and inappropriate with her. She didn't think it was a big enough deal. She never went back to that tute, skipped her computer lab assessment, and ended up failing the subject. So we gathered these experiences from one campus, but a recent survey from Australian University, a national survey from lots of different campuses, found that unfortunately these experiences are not uncommon. They found that 26% of people had been sexually harassed in a university setting in 2016. And you can see from these experiences that not only are they having a significant impact on people's mental health, but they're also coming with a significant opportunity cost because people are dropping out of classes. They're losing out on learning experiences and they just are feeling powerless to help. But you can see in this third scenario here that there's somebody else who has been witnessing this event or been told about it afterwards, and we call this person the bystander. And the bystander does have this unique opportunity to intervene. And a recent survey of Australian workplaces found that the most common outcome from a bystander taking action after witnessing sexual harassment in a workplace, the most common outcome was that the sexual harassment stopped. Okay? So we wanted to run a behavioural intervention in universities to see if there was some nudge or some behavioural intervention that we could use to encourage bystanders to take action after they witness these behaviours. And I'm going to share the results with you really quickly. So we found that sending a series of 5 behaviourally informed communications led to more people taking bystander action. And these communications that were effective emphasised the social norms that, firstly, most people studying on campus think it's right to take action. And secondly, most people said that they themselves would intervene if they saw these behaviours. So today I'm going to talk to you why we decided to run the trial in this way, how we designed it, and also we're going to dig into the results a bit more carefully. Okay, so why did we want bystanders to take action? So bystanders can be really powerful in this situation because they can serve a number of purposes. They can protect the target from further negative behaviour, and they can support them. They can discourage the perpetrator from engaging in further negative behaviour. And thirdly, they can play this really powerful role in kind of communicating to anybody else who's there which behaviours are and are not acceptable in our community. And when I say bystander action here, I don't necessarily mean somebody who has to, call something out in the moment. It can be both in the moment or after the moment. I understand that bystander action is a bit of a semantic paradox. What we mean is somebody is doing something about it. So it doesn't also necessarily mean putting yourself in the way of harm and putting yourself in the way of danger. Absolutely not. It could be something as simple as if your friend tells a sexist joke, you could not laugh along. You could say, I don't really understand why that joke is funny, can you tell me? Or you can take them aside afterwards and say, look, I think that joke was demeaning to women and I don't think it was acceptable. So it's taking some action that's communicating that this behaviour is not acceptable. So Unfortunately, the surveys that we also carried out also found that from the people who do witness or hear about these events, only around 30% of people are taking action. We then also have, I know if anyone who's at Cass Sunstein's plenary this morning will have heard that, there's different behavioural thresholds and there's different groups of people. So we also know that there are a group of people that, are committed not to take action and will be very hard to mobilise in this space. We also know that a majority of people, so around half, they are noticing sexism and sexual harassment. They're bothered by it and they want to do something about it. But when it comes to it in the moment, they don't take action. This is because they might not have the skills to take action. They really intend to, but they might feel afraid in the moment. But we do have this group there that we can try and mobilise to take action. So why aren't they currently taking action? If you can think of a time that you witnessed an inappropriate behaviour but you didn't actually do anything about it, maybe you can start to think of the types of reasons that students told us that they weren't taking action. So fear and anxiety, fear of what other people would think, not thinking it was their place, not really having the skills or confidence to take action. We heard lots of different reasons why students weren't actually doing anything. So we wanted to come up with an intervention that would overcome these barriers. So I'm just going to talk you quickly through what we actually did and before going into the results. So we co-designed with students and staff on the campus this email series. I think co-design was particularly important, as Betsy alluded to, when we were designing the content of these emails. So first of all, we wanted to make sure that people had the skills to recognise these behaviours, and also we wanted to give them strategies for how they could actually act. So rather than just saying things like take action, we wanted to give them actual lists of strategies that they might be able to use. And this was really important that we workshop this with the students, because I was using phrases such as, it's okay to meet and date on campus, but I was told I sounded like I was from the 18th century and it's all about the Netflix and chill these days and lots of other things. So we spent a lot of time with the students trying to workshop the perfect language that would resonate a bit more with them. And then also in the strategies that we told them to take, we wanted to know what they actually thought was appropriate, and when it was more appropriate to call something out, when it was appropriate to report behaviours, and lots of different things like that. So we tried to be as behaviourally specific as we can. If your friend tells a sexist joke, as I said, you could ask them why it was funny. You could talk to them afterwards. If there was somebody who was a target of the joke, you could check in with them. So lots of strategies there. So we call this the know-how. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the results in a minute, and the know-how means these behavioural strategies for both recognising and reacting to these behaviours. We also wanted to communicate that active bystanding was a desirable behaviour, that was a desirable social norm. Okay? So we wanted to highlight the social norms around taking action. So I guess most of you here will have heard of the Behavioural Insights team, very infamous trial, 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time. So this social norms message on a tax letter brought forward millions in tax revenue. And this is because humans are social creatures. We like to behave in a way that we think others think that we should be behaving, in a way that we think others are behaving, and so on. So we wanted to come up with a social norms message, but you might now be thinking, wait a minute, I just said that only 30% of people actually took action in these scenarios. So we designed 2 different versions of the social norms message. So when we surveyed students, we found that most students actually think it's right to call out someone for various different behaviours. It's right to take action. And also people say that they themselves would intervene. So this was the first social norms message that we used. We were also, I don't know, if most of you who have taken an introductory psychology course will have heard of the bystander effect. So this is the effect that when you witness an inappropriate behaviour, there's a lot of kind of original findings that you might be less likely to take action if you think that somebody else will. I think this effect is kind of, there's a lot of debate about it at the moment in the academic literature, but we wanted to also think, if we let students know that only a few people are actually taking action, could we then encourage them to take action by highlighting this? So our second version of the norm was a minority social norm. So we said most of us studying on campus think it's right. So we have the injunctive majority norm there, but only 36% of us actually do. So this was to try and motivate action in that way. It's really important that when you're designing social norms that they are true and that they're kind of targeted and they're from the group that you're trying to target as well. So that was another really important thing for us. So we used a randomized control trial to test the impact of our 2 different social norms messages. So firstly, we recruited 30,000 people from 3 faculties. So this was actually an opt-out intervention, so everybody in those 3 faculties was automatically enrolled in our trial. They could choose to unsubscribe if they wanted. It was really important to have quite this big sample size because we were running the trial over such a short period of time that we wanted to see, we wanted to have such a big sample size that we would actually have people who would witness these behaviours. So we randomly allocated these 30,000 people into one of 4 different groups. So the first group was a control group, and they received no email communications. They didn't receive the series that we created, which was business as usual in the university at the time. And we just gave them this follow-up evaluation at the end. Secondly, we had the know-how group. So this group were given the behavioural strategies that I talked about, outlining the university's stance on these behaviours and also how to witness or how to notice them and also what they could do in response. Thirdly, we had the majority norm group. So they received this know-how information and paired with that majority norm message at the top of the communications. And finally, we had the minority norm group. So they received the other variant. So only 36% of people actually do take action. So now I'm going to talk you through the results. But first, quickly, I'll just tell you how we actually evaluated the interventions. So we developed a behavioural survey tool because a lot of bystander interventions are evaluated looking at people's intentions, how they might intend to act in the future, or their attitudes. But we know that behaviours don't necessarily translate into, or intentions don't always necessarily translate into behaviours. So what we did was we created a tool that asked people if they had witnessed sexism or sexual harassment in the previous 8 weeks, and only those who had witnessed it, we then asked them if they had taken action or not. We also used behaviourally specific items. So instead of asking people, did you witness sexual harassment, we broke it down into behaviours. So, for example, did you witness someone pestering someone else for sex or to go out on a date? Because we know that making this more specific language and giving examples leads to a much higher rate of people actually reporting these behaviours. We split the results into responding to sexual harassment and sexism, and this is because these are interpreted quite differently sometimes. So the first results I'm going to talk you through are in response to sexual harassment. So this chart shows the number of people who took action after witnessing sexual harassment. And you can see that in the control group, around 32% of people took action after witnessing these behaviours. And you can see that in the best performing email series, which is the know-how group that was paired with the majority norms social norms message, which said that 75% of people, or whatever percent, said that they themselves would take action. This was the most effective, and it led to a 10% increase in people taking action from the control group. So just to dig into those results a bit further, 2,500 people responded to our survey, and of those, 1 in 3 had witnessed sexual harassment in the previous 8 weeks. Oh, no, it was actually the previous 8. Oh, sorry. I'll wrap it up really quickly. So, and we also found that this 10% increase, if we had just sent this to everybody who responded to our survey, this could have led to 83 more incidents where people took action. And if you think back to the start where I was, going through these experiences, just one of these, if it could have been prevented, would make such a difference to somebody's life. We also looked at sexism separately, and these results are a little bit less clear-cut. So when we looked at the gender differences in response to sexual harassment, which I just presented, there were no gender differences there. But when we looked at sexism, we found quite a stark gender difference. So we found that for women, both of the social norms messages were effective at increasing action against sexism. So just to remind you that this is the rates of people taking action after they had witnessed the behaviour. But we didn't find that the email series was effective for men. And I think this kind of throws open a lot more questions than it does answers, but it's a really interesting finding. And I think we also found, we measured a lot of other things, and we found that men were less likely to notice sexism, and they were less likely to see it. When they did notice it, they were less likely to interpret it as requiring intervention. So there were some other differences there. But I think what we would need to do then is to do some additional co-design workshops to try and reach a broader group of men, and target interventions targeting sexism should be kind of more carefully co-designed with men. And just finally, we found some other interesting things about what did not predict behaviour change. So overall engagement with the email series, which we measured by people opening all 5 emails in the series, it didn't predict behaviour. So the know-how group, without the social norms messaging, was actually the one that was open the most. And the majority norms email had the lowest level of engagement. And often, public health campaigns might use open rates as a proxy for behaviour, whereas we found that, it's probably not the best idea. And secondly, we found that intentions to take action were not a good predictor of behaviour. So there was only a moderate relationship between people's intentions to take action and whether they actually took action in response to the behaviours or not. And this is really important because often bystander interventions are evaluated using, okay, so you've done this training or you've done this intervention, and how would you intend to act in the future? So it's really important that we do try and measure behaviours. We also found that the email was quite well received, with less than a 1% unsubscribe rate from the trial. So the key takeaways here are that bystander action is needed, but bystanders do need encouragement. And communicating social norms, highlighting that the majority say that they themselves would take action, is one solution. It's not the only solution, but we did find some evidence for it here. And we also found that men and women may need different approaches when we're targeting sexism. And just before I end, I think it's really important as well to say that the organisation that you're working with, if you're thinking of running some sort of intervention like this, it's really important that they have systems and processes in place to deal with, for example, increased rates of reporting as caused by an intervention like this, and that there's top-down organisational support and there's good sexual harassment policies before you try and do something that's going to cause more people to take action, because it sends a really bad message if more people are reporting and still nothing is being done. And we were lucky enough that the university that we were working in did have good systems in place. So as Tiina said, these results are going to be launched in about 3 weeks with a host of other tools. So there's a summary report, there's a guide for if people want to run bystander interventions, how they can rigorously evaluate them, if their organisation is ready, and lots of things around how we designed our survey tool and our emails. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, you can get in touch with me and I'll be happy to share in a few weeks. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, both. Those are some really exciting results and interesting presentations. We have some questions that are coming in from the group, but I thought I'd just kick off with a couple of my own. Chair's privilege. So, in your views, based on your understanding of the field, why are we having Me Too today? Why are we still in a place where what most people understand we live in an equal society? These things should not be acceptable. Why have we not made more progress to tackle sexual harassment and assault? I don't know if Betsy, you want to go first and offer some reflections on that.
I think I just think about society in a much more cynical way. I'm really glad that Me Too happened. I didn't expect things to be equal. So I think that Me Too is an incredible example of the power of narrative and storytelling. I think that the incredible response to Me Too is an example of social networks and how these kinds of narratives can become very viral and sticky. But I think that that we're moving along at a pace that is really exciting, and I think that we're at a moment now where there's been so much momentum that what I worry about the most is how to capitalize on that momentum. And I think a lot about different types of interventions. I love how you all had a script for people, for example, right? But I also think about, the development of norms means that people are willing to punish, to intervene. But I also wonder, what kinds of scripts we should be promoting in the first place about, how to talk, to one another in the workplace and at university, rather than how to punish people for not saying the right thing. So positive messages about how to move forward. I'd love to see a lot more models of that too. Anyway, that's a little bit of a roundabout way of answering. But
of course, great. And if you wanted to add anything, Iseult.
I think just on reflecting on what Cass Sunstein said in the plenary session today, it's kind of like bringing what people's intentions are in their heads out into the public, so that they can become this social norm, and that they know that other people don't, kind of like the bystander stuff here, that people don't think that others are going to look down on them or think they're rude if they take action when they witness these behaviours, but rather actually most people do think that this is acceptable, and they think, post Me Too, that these behaviours are unacceptable. So I think, it's kind of about getting those good intentions out there and those social norms out there as well.
Okay, so the next question then is, we have a lot of people here at the conference who represent different organisations, different governments, and are trying to tackle this. What 2 or 3 things can we say today, based on behavioural science, that there are sort of 2 or 3 things that most organisations should do now to tackle sexual harassment or prevent it? Whichever one.
Well, I think, and we're actually kind of releasing this guide in a few weeks, and this is specifically on bystander interventions, but I think it's really important to have organisational support from the top, and to have a sexual harassment policy that is enforceable and enforced and in language that staff can understand, and it's used regularly. And I think it's really important to have proper reporting systems in place, that if people report these behaviours, that something is done about it, and that relates to senior people too. And then you can start doing the types of bystander interventions that we're talking about here. But I think all of those foundations need to be in place for an organisation before that you then start encouraging your staff to notice and kind of call out these behaviours.
Great. Betsy?
I think we're really at the beginnings of getting evidence for what's working, and that's something that my research group has really been focused on. One thing that we know about supporting diversity in general in the workplace is, similar to what you're mentioning, is making one person particularly responsible for supporting not just the attraction, but the flourishing of diversity in the workplace. So this is a Frank Dobbin series of work with a lot of different colleagues, but I would suggest that is something to consider in the realm of sexual harassment as well.
So accountability.
Accountability, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great. I think quite a few people have voted up to ask you about your intervention in Uganda. I'm mindful of time. Can you give us the headlines?
Totally. Yes. Thank you for asking. I always run over. In Uganda, the reason I wanted to bring up that study, this is in partnership with the IRC and a bunch of really amazing colleagues there. The idea here was to meet people where they're actually motivated to receive some sort of counseling or to change. And so we designed a couples counseling intervention. So this is a counseling intervention for couples who want to get married. So this is actually a booming business in places all over the world, where if you want to get married in a Christian church, for example, you have to go to counseling first for counseling with the pastor or the priest. And so we thought, what about inserting more egalitarian, even feminist theological messages that are supported by texts from the Bible about not just sharing power in a relationship, but also seeing to one another's pleasure. And so we ran an RCT in Uganda to test this out. And what we found so far is a reduction in violence following up with these couples post couples counseling. We interview both members of the couple. We also find a rebalancing in power in terms of household decision making. But this is what we were most concerned about. That sometimes you really worry about violence coming as a backlash when power is ceded or taken by the woman partner in a relationship. And so one thing that we observed in this is that some of this ceding of power, it was really offset by an increase in the perceived value of the relationship. And translating that into simple terms, they were having a better time together. And this couples counseling was actually about what can you do to listen to one another and so forth. So some of this more positive messaging that was actually giving them scripts about how to support one another and how to actually be in a more egalitarian relationship. So I like that because it's also meeting people where they're at. It's finding where the motivations are in the community. And here it was, we want to get married. Here's an obstacle, so we place the intervention right there. And then, and actually trying to go off of their own motivation to actually enjoy their relationship and using really significant members of the community, their pastors, to intervene.
And I might just end with one quick question, which is sort of mentioned, which is around, you've both talked about accountability and you've talked about the importance of leadership and sort of top-down people saying, this is really important, we need to change. What are some concrete things that leaders can do to actually create change in their organizations?
I would say sending very clear messages about the norms of the organization. So not just the rules, but also this is not what we do here, or this is what we do here, and actually following up. But I think also to get more at this social norms approach, finding people who are significant in that organization to work with you on that. So, who's the equivalent of the social club presidents who can work with you to reach out to different sub-communities, because I think that all, purely top-down messaging is going to miss a lot of those and sometimes even become an object of ridicule in particular sub-communities in organizations.
And I think maybe it's a slightly different question for you because I'm mindful that this is a democratic process. So a couple of people are very interested in the gender differences that you found in your study. There's a question of do we know, or do you have an initial view on why there is this different response by men and women to sexism? And then there's, another question on are men, why are men less likely to intervene? Is it because of backlash? So quite a few questions on understanding how the same intervention had a different impact on women and men.
Yeah. So firstly, I think sexual harassment can be seen as a more overt behaviour that people recognise. And so we did see that men were less likely to notice sexism than women were. And broadly speaking, sexism is experienced by women more often than men. And as I said, we did see that they also, when they did notice it, saw it as less likely as requiring intervention than women did. So there are some other interesting gender things we found. But as to why our email series didn't have as much of an impact in terms of trying to encourage action after witnessing sexism, we don't really know. What we think is that, when we invited people to co-design sessions, we probably got people who were quite involved and quite interested in making a difference, and the men that we got there. So perhaps it's trying to find a broader community and maybe finding a messenger. So the messenger that we used for these emails were faculty heads. So maybe if there's a messenger that might resonate more with men. So as Betsy says, it's not like a top-down messenger, but maybe somebody who is, has another type of social standing. But I think, we're interested in what other people think as well. These are the initial theories that we have, but we're not quite sure. So.
Yes. And I know Betsy's done some fascinating work on social reference. So I don't know if you wanted to, we're out of time, but just a quick comment on who is the right messenger.
Whoever people are paying attention to. So looking within subcultures, they don't have to be the most outstanding models of behavior, but it's the people who they're paying the most attention to.
Brilliant. Please join me in thanking both of our panelists.